Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is a presentation of the Sustainable Solar Education Project, which is managed by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and supported by the Sunshot Initiative through the U.S. Department of Energy. This webinar is on the topic of advice for states on providing solar information to consumers. And we have two representatives here with us from the Clean Energy States Alliance who are going to be talking more with us about that topic. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer, mic, and speakers. Both of those options are fine. There are some instructions on your screen for that. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions throughout the webinar, and we will save some time at the end of our presentation for a Q&A with the audience. We expect to have a good turnout for this webinar, so there should be a lot of people on the line who are also trying to ask questions. Get yours in soon so that we can make sure that we get to them, and do type them in when you're thinking of them. Don't wait until the end to submit your questions. Final note, this webinar is being recorded, and you will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous CESA webinars archived on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And we will also send you a follow-up email within about 24 hours with a link to the recording and the slides of this webinar. So with that, I will pass it over to Nate Hausman. Nate is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance.
Thanks, Samantha. And before I turn things over to Warren Leon to discuss the guide he's authored, I want to tell you a little bit about who the Clean Energy States Alliance is and what the Sustainable Solar Education Project is. So the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA, we're a national nonprofit network of public agencies and organizations. We work together to advance clean energy. We're made up mostly of state agencies. You can see all of our members on this slide. And if you wouldn't mind switching to the next, yep. The guide we'll be discussing today is the first in a series of Sustainable Solar Education Projects guides that we'll be releasing. The Sustainable Solar Education Project is a CESA-run project to help state and municipal officials ensure that distributed solar electricity remains consumer-friendly and benefits low and moderate income households. We think both these issues, solar consumer protection and solar equitability, are important for the solar market's sustained long-term growth. And as Samantha already noted, our project is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy Sunshot Initiative. So through the Sustainable Solar Education Project, we're developing a variety of resources for state and municipal officials on the topics I already noted, solar consumer protection and solar equitability. The resources include program guides like this one. We'll be releasing more webinars like the one we're on right now, online course material. We'll also be doing some in-person training, and we have a monthly newsletter which includes announcements, news items, and project updates related to our topics. So if you can sign up for our newsletter using the link that's on this screen, and you can find more information about the Sustainable Solar Education Project via CESA's website. I also just want to let you know that on December 8th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll conduct a Sustainable Solar Education Project webinar more generally on solar consumer protection issues, and we'll be sending an announcement about that webinar very soon, so stay tuned for that. Okay, well, with that, let me turn things over to CESA's Executive Director, Warren Leon. Warren oversees CESA's day-to-day operations and leads our strategy development. He also directs CESA's state-federal RPS collaborative. He's authored many reports on clean energy over the years, in addition to the one he'll be discussing today, titled Solar Information for Consumers, a Guide for States. Warren is an adjunct professor at Brandeis International Business School. Prior to working for CESA, Warren was director of the Massachusetts Renewable Energy Trust, executive director of the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association, and deputy director for programs at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He co-authored the book, The Consumer's Guide to Effective Environmental Choices, and he has a PhD from Harvard University. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Warren.
Hey, thanks very much, Nate. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk about this guide that we're going to be discussing today. And just so folks know, my plan is to give you an overview of the guide, its key messages, some of its recommendations, and I'm going to do that in 30 minutes, which will then leave us a good amount of time for your questions or comments. So this guide, which you could get for free by clicking on the website at the link at the bottom, covers 5 topics. Why states should focus on consumer information, what recommendations we have for producing effective consumer information on solar. It lists various topics that states might consider sharing information on. We present 8 different models from states of things that have been done already that can be emulated and repeated more broadly. And we cover a variety of different resources that can be used by states as well as by municipalities or utilities or other organizations that want to provide good, impartial information to consumers about solar. Now, I'm not going to cover everything in the guide, but I'm going to particularly focus on our recommendations and some of the models today. But let me say a few things about why states should focus on consumer protection and consumer information. There are hundreds of thousands of people every year installing solar. That's great. And we want to see that continue to happen. And we want to ensure that those folks have a good experience, that they're satisfied with their purchases, so that there continues to be public support for solar going forward. Now, states are in a especially good position for providing consumers with sound information that can enable them to make appropriate decisions. Good information not only helps the consumers, but it can also advance the state's interests. States have developed a number of solar programs that they have out there, and to ensure the success of those programs, they want consumers to be able to make decisions that they're happy with and that continue to advance solar in an appropriate and non-disruptive way. On top of that, when you have good consumer information materials easily accessible to the public, it can reduce the number of individual inquiries that state agencies get from consumers, and it can also reduce the number of problems and complaints that come in from consumers. So those are a few reasons, and in the guide we talk about a number of other reasons why states should focus on good consumer information. But let me turn to some of the topics that states could cover. I'm not going to go over this, but I put this list out there for you to look at to show you that there's a large number of different possible things states can consider providing information on. And different states are going to have different needs and different interests, but this is a pretty comprehensive list of the types of things that you could choose from and inform the public about. But what I want to focus more attention on is some of our recommendations for producing effective consumer information for on solar. These apply no matter what topic you're covering. And the first one is to present solar in an even-handed manner. There's a lot of good information out there on the internet about solar, but most of the information that consumers are going to come across is going to be very favorable towards installing solar. It's going to be produced and disseminated by solar installers, by advocacy groups that support solar, and that makes sense that they're going to present a very favorable position on solar, and it's good for consumers to hear that, and it's good for states to reinforce that and say, yes, there are reasons why individual homeowners should consider installing solar on their house, and there are reasons why businesses should consider installing solar on their businesses. But it's important to also explain that you need to think about this decision very carefully. You need to proceed with it cautiously, and that for many people, it might not make sense to install solar. It's not going to be the right choice in all cases, and consumers need to see that there are both reasons for doing it and reasons why it's not going to make sense in certain situations. A state can help consumers to understand the need for caution and give them a range of questions that they can ask before they make a final decision. A second recommendation is to make information easy to understand, visually appealing, and easy to use. That seems obvious, but a lot of state websites, like a lot of government websites, are relatively dense. They're not so easy to follow. They're not comparable to the best commercial websites out there, the type of websites that the public is used to looking at and used to easily getting information from. States, when they put together solar consumer information, should be trying to emulate the best commercial sites. The information for consumers should be placed on a distinct web page, not mixed in with stuff that's aimed at other audiences. For example, it shouldn't be on the same page with technical specifications for installers or program descriptions for grant applicants or background information about how the state agency is structured. It should be dedicated to the specific task of giving consumers the information they need in order to make good, appropriate decisions. On the website, one should speak to consumers in a clear, direct manner that assumes they have no prior knowledge of solar. You can help them by focusing on the most important information, by including short lists of clear key points rather than providing dense copy that buries the key points somewhere down in the middle of the third paragraph. Divide the material into short topics with links to each section so that a consumer can easily find the specific information they're looking for and don't feel overwhelmed. Now, the last suggestion here moves in a slightly different direction. The ideal solar consumer information website would have the information divided in these bite-sized chunks, but would also have it all compiled into a single document, because some consumers are going to find it useful to get a larger document, a PDF, download it, print it out, save it as a reference work as they go through the process of deciding on and proceeding with a solar installation. It's important to emphasize dissemination as much as materials development. The best information does no good if the intended audience doesn't know about it. And emphasis on dissemination is key. Now, one thing that really helps to highlight this solar consumer information is if a state can do a standalone website. I'll come back to that under the section of the talk about models. I realize that's not possible in all cases, but the ideal approach would be to have a distinct website with its own identity, its own brand, its own email address. That can make it easy to market and easy for consumers to find it. But whether or not you can do that, it's possible to do media outreach about the solar information you produce. You can also encourage others to link to and promote the state's information. You could reach out to utilities, municipalities, solar installers, solar advocates, energy organizations, and consumer groups, and get all of them to widely distribute the fact that the state has good solar communication information available. The information is objective and it's impartial and it's designed to be useful to consumers in that state, and they can link to it. You can implement search engine optimization. That's a way in which you can maximize the number of people who find your information when they do a Google search or a search through another search engine. And you can keep in mind the fact that you as a state agency produce a variety of other documents related to solar, and every time you produce those documents, you can include a plug for your solar consumer information and a link to it. You could also include a link from your agency homepage. The fourth of my 6 suggestions is to describe the state's direct involvement in solar. There are some topics that consumers have a right to assume the state is going to describe clearly for them, and that this information is going to be easy to find. Consumers are going to expect that they should be able to find information about any relevant state laws, tax credits, incentives, and programs. All that information should be in one location so that consumers don't need to go to 4 different web pages of 4 different organizations. Now, sometimes different agencies are responsible for different laws or different programs or different policies. That's fine, but there should be one place where all of this information is available with links to all of those different agencies. There are also some topics that you might not initially think of as topics that relate to state policies and programs, but that the public may not realize they're not state topics. A consumer may not realize that permitting is in many places a local responsibility rather than a state responsibility. Members of the public may not realize that in some places interconnection is a utility responsibility rather than a state responsibility. For that reason, it's good to cover those topics because you need to deal with not just the reality of the situation, but the public's expectations and prior knowledge. Another good topic to cover is federal tax credits. Even though that's clearly not a state responsibility, it is something that really influences the economics of a solar installation, and there are going to be changes in terms of federal tax credit rates over time, and it's good to keep the public informed of those sorts of things. The next suggestion is to give high priority to solar financing. In recent years, additional solar financing options have come into the marketplace, things like leases and power purchase agreements, and a very high percentage of the installations have been done with those mechanisms. In the last year or two, the number of solar loan options has grown. All of that is good for the marketplace in the sense that it gives consumers additional options. It's helped fuel the growing market penetration of solar. But when consumers have more choices, it means their decisions are more complicated. This can be a very confusing area for them, and it's easy for consumers to make decisions that they later regret because they don't have full information. It's especially an issue with leases and power purchase agreements because consumers may not psychologically think about them as being as big a financial decision as they are. When somebody is going to plunk down $30,000 for a solar system, they know that's a big decision. When they enter into a power purchase agreement or a lease that doesn't require a down payment and actually will save them money on their electric bill in the first month, they may think of that as a simple, easy decision. It's still a $30,000 decision, even though they're not plunking down that money up front. And so they really need help in sorting through this confusing area. States should provide information about the types of finance options that are available in the state, the advantages and disadvantages of each, and which options tend to be best in which type of circumstances. A state can suggest questions that consumers should ask of lenders and installers. And then my sixth recommendation here is to draw on pre-existing resources. A state or a municipality or a utility that wants to produce and provide good consumer information doesn't need to start from scratch. There's lots of good information out there that can be linked to, and in many cases the organizations can allow you to adapt their materials and modify them with permission for use on a state or municipal website. You know, among the pre-existing resources that are useful are what other states have done, what the U.S. Department of Energy has produced, as well as the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, information utilities have put out there, the Solar Energy Industries Association has put out there, stuff from universities, nonprofit organizations, and commercial websites. And we list some of these in the other resources section of our guide, and I'll actually come back to them a little later in our presentation. So what are some models and approaches for states to consider? I'm going to go through a bunch of them. The gold standard is a dedicated solar consumer information website. This is the ideal approach. You put everything out there on a distinct web page in an attractive, well-organized format. Now, this is ideal, but it may not be possible for every state to do it. First of all, it tends to require some considerable resources. On top of that, some state agencies don't have the ability, because of state government website rules, to create a distinct website design like this with a distinct URL, so that might not work in some cases. If the only impediment is resources, you can sometimes look for a partner to work with you on this sort of website. The state that's done the best job with this so far is Connecticut through the Connecticut Green Bank. Their site is well organized, it's inviting, it's non-intimidating, it's organized into 4 key sections, makes it seem, the organization seems simple and easy for the consumer to follow. Like all websites, this one has advantages and disadvantages. We talk about some of those in the guide. This website in its current version was produced by the Connecticut Green Bank along with Energy Sage, which is a commercial marketplace for solar that's produced some very good materials. The current version launched in July of 2016. So that's one approach. A different approach is to produce a comprehensive guide, a single document for download. A good example of this is the Vermonter's Guide to Residential Solar that was published by the Vermont Public Service Department. This guide tries to be user-friendly. It tries to put all the information in one place. It bills itself as a reference work. It doesn't assume that somebody's going to sit down and read all 50 pages at one time, but that the consumer will use different sections at different stages of their decision and installation processes. This one's tried very hard to be even-handed and explain all the situations where doing solar will make good sense, and also explain those situations where it might not be a good idea for a homeowner or a business to go forward with a solar installation. Now, this information, which is great in this one guide, would be even better if, as I suggested before, it was divided up into bite-sized chunks and placed on the website in those smaller chunks so that a consumer could just go to that without having to look through a larger document. Now, this particular guide was produced in great part by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and if a state looks at it and says they'd like to have a version of this, we'd be happy to work with them to create a version tailored to their state. Now, an alternative to this is something much simpler. A state can provide effective and useful information while doing something short and low budget. A good example of this is the 3-page consumer guide that the Arizona Residential Utility Consumer Office produced. It's only 3 pages, but it packs a lot into those 3 pages, including things like factors to consider before purchasing a system, how having a system affects a homeowner's relationship to the grid. It provides some advice on how to choose an installer, and it has bulleted lists of key points to consider. But even if you do this low budget, short bit of information, because you don't have the time or the budget for something more elaborate, it's still important to make sure you set aside sufficient resources to do a good job with marketing, because it doesn't do any good to produce something like this and have it buried somewhere on the web where the intended audience can't find it. Another model, which is, as I suggested before, is to focus on solar financing explicitly. The New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department in 2015 produced a homeowner's guide to solar leases, loans, and power purchase agreements. Now, this guide defines common terms, it explains each financing option, and it identifies advantages and disadvantages of each of the options. Now, it's really good to focus on this area because it's a confusing area for consumers, and there have been issues in some states of misleading sales tax practices or consumer dissatisfaction, and so it's good to really make sure consumers can get the information they need in order to make the best possible decisions. Now, this guide is actually a New Mexico-specific version of a generic homeowner's guide to solar financing that CESA produced. And what New Mexico did was take our generic guide and put in all the New Mexico-specific information to make sure it dealt with the exact situation in their state. Massachusetts and New York have done something like that as well, and we're happy to work with other states that want to produce a guide specifically tailored for their state. States can also produce materials on specific topics. In Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources produced a guide specifically aimed at condominium owners and associations. They did that because they realized that there are special legal and financial issues that projects at condominiums face that other solar installations don't face, so they wanted to give that information to that important audience. A big growing area for solar across the country has been community solar. But this is an area in which there are some special consumer information issues and special consumer protection issues that need to be addressed. States that want to have a vibrant community solar market should be thinking about what sorts of information should they be giving to consumers so that consumers can make good decisions about community solar. A good starting point to think about what sorts of information a state can produce is to go to the website of the Minnesota Department of Commerce, where they've produced some very useful tips about community solar related to the community solar installations in their state. And on that website, they also include links to more information that's available on the website of the Clean Energy Resource Teams, which is a statewide partnership there in Minnesota. Another type of information that states can provide is a list of solar installers. This can make it convenient and easy for consumers to find an installer in their state. But what's crucial in this case is if a state has a list of solar installers on their website, you need to make very clear what's the nature of the list. Maybe it's a list of every installer in the state or every installer who has participated in a particular state program or every installer who's sent in their names to the state agency. Consumers may assume when they see a list on a state website that somehow that list has been vetted, that the state is endorsing and recommending the companies on the list. If that's not the case, if it's just a list of installers whose names have been collected by the state, that needs to be made very clear to the website user so that they're under no incorrect impression that somehow there's a special recommendation implied. A state can go beyond the more generic, undifferentiated list and actually make recommendations. And Energy Trust of Oregon has a very interesting program called the Trade Industry Allies Program. And they try to point consumers towards their trade industry allies. Those participating contractors have all participated in webinar training. They all meet minimum insurance requirements. They all have Oregon Construction Contractors Board licenses, and none of them have any unresolved complaints from Energy Trust customers. States can provide maps and calculators. This can help consumers estimate the electricity generating potential of their rooftops. It can help them compare the potential on their building to that of other buildings in the area. The DC Solar Map uses Map12 Solar, which is the most advanced commercially available solar mapping system. In effect, this is a very sophisticated solar calculator which measures the roof area and based on that indicates how big a system you could place on that building at most, and it calculates how much electricity that system might generate, and it calculates what sort of income you might get from that and what it might lead in the way of electricity savings. This sort of map, which is very useful, is the type of thing a state can disseminate, but it's important if there's any map or solar calculator on a website to make clear to consumers that these sorts of internet tools are not a substitute for an on-site analysis of the property by a trained solar professional. Now, the Map12 solar system that DC Solar Map uses is relatively costly, so it's more suitable for a city or a small area than for some very large covering every property in a very large state. An alternative is a state can link to a pre-existing map, such as Google Project Sunroof, or to a pre-existing solar calculator, such as NREL's PV Watts. Now, if a state does that, it's important to keep in mind that different calculators produce different results because they have different assumptions in it. And it's important to choose a map or a calculator very carefully, because you could end up with one that provides inflated results of consumers' potential savings and can lead to some dissatisfied customers if they rely too heavily on that map or solar calculator. As a bottom line, it's important to make sure that any calculator you use is one that has transparency in its assumptions, that reveals its assumptions about future electricity rates, installation costs, and discount rates. It's inappropriate to promote a calculator that's a black box that spits out numbers that neither you as a state that's putting the calculator on your website or the consumer can really figure out how those numbers were derived. Finally, states can put out solar statistics. You can inform residents of the amount of solar capacity in the state, and you can go beyond that to include a lot of other information, such as where the systems are located, what are the costs of the systems, what are their sizes, who are the installers. Now, not every state has all that information, so not all of it's practical, and there are cases where states won't feel comfortable putting out cost information, but it's good to think about the range of possible information about solar installations in the state that's available and decide what you do or don't want to put out. In terms of solar statistics, the gold standard is the California Solar Statistics webpage, which is part of the Go Solar California website. They have an incredible amount of detailed information, including the megawatts installed by utility, by county, by month, the average cost per watt. Individual can put in a zip code and a radius area around that zip code and find all the projects that have been approved for interconnection since mid-2015, and they could search them by location, by size, by cost per watt, by contractor. Now, this particular website is really strong in terms of the information there. Some of it may be a little intimidating or a little overwhelming for the average consumer, but it's good information for a state or a municipality to think about when they're trying to figure out what sort of information they put on their own website. Up till now, I've provided some models from different states that states could consider emulating, and in the guide we have more information about them, as well as links to all of their locations on the internet. But beyond what states have produced, there are a lot of other resources out there. And I'm not going to go through all of these now, but in the guide we describe a bunch of different resources, and these are the ones that are on this current page. We talk about materials from Consumer Reports, the Desire database of state incentives for renewables and efficiency, Energy Stage, which is a commercial marketplace that has interesting information on it, Google Project Sunroof, what its pluses and minuses are, Let's Go Solar, which is another private sector website with a wide range of solar information. The Louisiana State University Ag Center has produced a comprehensive solar guide that can be an interesting model for states to consider. Although it was done in Louisiana, it's not Louisiana specific. It tries to provide more generic national information. NREL has good information, including the Open PV project and the PV Watts solar calculator, which I mentioned previously. There's Solar Reviews, which is a website that provides consumer reviews of solar installers and solar companies. The Solar Energy Industry Association has produced good materials, including a residential consumer guide, which is another short, low-budget guide that can be a good model for states to consider adapting or linking to. CESA also has state policy, solar policy pages, and it's worth looking at what they're saying about your state. Finally, the U.S. Department of Energy has a homeowner's guide to going solar, which is something states can consider linking to or adapting in ways for their own use. So that's really what I wanted to cover here. I want to leave you with the message that as the solar industry grows, as more and more individuals consider going solar, we want to ensure that they have the resources they need to make sound decisions. And states have the opportunity to be the ones to give them the information so that they are able to make those sound decisions. Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. That's great. Well, now let's take some questions. So if you haven't already, type your questions into the chat box on your screen, and we'll do our best to get to them. You know, one person noted in the chat box that utilities also provide information, and I wondered if you might comment on whether states should be pointing to utility sites. For example, utilities sometimes provide hosting capacity maps. And utilities often provide other information around interconnection. What's the interplay between utility information and state websites?
That's a good question. And it is true that utilities provide a lot of good information, and states should, in some cases, point to it. But what states need to do first is to look at that information and make sure it's information they are comfortable pointing to. In some cases, they will be. In some cases, they may feel it's information that they don't want to emphasize because they'd rather present it themselves. You got to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. States shouldn't just assume that consumers are going to go to the utilities for the information. Even if the utilities have good information out there, and states like the information that the utilities are providing, the states somewhere on their own website should indicate that, hey, we think these utilities have useful information for you, and here's how you get to it.
Great, thanks. Another question for you on how, do you have evidence that these solar resources that states produce actually get used and get used frequently? And what should states be doing to track these kinds of things?
Well, it really varies state by state. Now, some states keep track of the traffic to different pages on their website, and so they have some sense of how widely these things are being used. In other cases, the stuff gets posted and forgotten, and no one knows whether it's being used or not. I would say there are cases where the materials are getting good use, but I would say in almost every case, not every case, because there are a couple of states like Connecticut and California that have been very aggressive in their marketing of their websites. But I would say in most cases where states have fallen down is not doing enough in terms of marketing their materials. So the stuff's getting used, but not as widely as ideally we would like it to be.
I've got some state-specific questions, and I think I'll hold off on those. And I've got also some other folks have noted other resources available, and I appreciate that. IREC, for example, has some consumer protection resources available as well. One other question. You know, all the stuff you've suggested, Warren, you know, requires funding. Is there funding sources available for this kind of material that you've listed here? Do you have suggestions about how to persuade state actors to do this?
Well, I would say, yes, this does require funding, and certainly some of the more ambitious projects, like a standalone comprehensive website, requires some significant funding. But when I think of all the things state energy agencies spend their money on, providing information resources is relatively cheap. If you go back and think about that 3-page document from Arizona that provides some guidance, the cost of that is relatively inexpensive. It wouldn't take avoiding, you know, you only need to have maybe 2 customers in the whole state of Arizona be discouraged from making a decision that they don't regret to justify the cost of producing something like that. And in the case of something that's more ambitious, like the more comprehensive guide on solar financing that New Mexico did, even there, if you look at the budget for that and think of cost and benefit to the citizens of the state, it doesn't take having very many people use that guide to justify its cost.
Thanks. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat box right now. So unless we get any in the next couple seconds, we'll close this out. I do want to remind folks, we hope you'll join us for future CESA webinars, and I do want to remind you that we'll be having one on December 8th on consumer protection issues more broadly. Warren, I want to thank you, and with that, I'll pass it over to Samantha for closeout.
Thanks, Nate. So up on the screen, we have some contact information for our presenters on today's webinar, and we also have a link to our website, CESA's Sustainable Solar Education Project website, where you can find out information about our upcoming webinars, read an archive of our newsletters and sign up for that, and get a lot more useful information, as well as a link to the guide that we discussed today. So I would encourage you to visit that website. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope to see you again on December 8th for our next webinar. Bye, everybody.